Look at her, Your Honor. She's a pillhead who can't even stand up straight. That's exactly what my husband told the judge. I was 34 years old. I was gripping the edge of the defendant's table so hard my knuckles were stark, bloodless white. The wood beneath my fingers was old, scored with the indentations of 1,000 desperate fingernails that had stood exactly where I was standing. The courtroom smelled of lemon floor polish, stale air conditioning, and the faint, sour tang of nervous sweat. I was wearing a cheap gray blazer that I had bought at a thrift store 3 days prior, draped awkwardly over a plastic surgical drain that was taped directly to my stomach. Every time I inhaled, the thick adhesive pulled at my raw skin, and a hot, sharp ache radiated through my pelvis. I had just lost a baby 3 weeks prior. My body was entirely broken. My center of gravity felt hollowed out, replaced by a dull, throbbing emptiness that made my knees tremble. Lorcan smirked at me across the center aisle. He was leaning back in his heavy leather chair, looking like a man who had just won a hand of poker. His lawyer, a man with a sharp nose and a suit that cost more than my car, was already packing up his briefcase. He clicked his expensive gold pen shut, looking entirely bored with the whole proceeding. They thought this was just a standard, open and shut emergency eviction hearing. They thought I was going to be sleeping in my beat-up Honda Civic by nightfall. She needs to vacate the property today, Lorcan added, adjusting his expensive crimson silk tie with a casual flick of his wrist. I can't have her sickness infecting my home anymore. It's not safe for me, and frankly, Your Honor, it's not safe for the neighborhood. Mr. Vance, your petition notes erratic behavior, the judge said, peering over his reading glasses. Erratic is putting it mildly, Lorcan lied smoothly, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. She hallucinates, she screams at all hours. I've tried to get her help, I really have. But she refuses treatment, she just wants the pills. I didn't cry. The back of my throat burned, and a familiar, frantic pressure built behind my eyes. But I swallowed it down like jagged glass. I didn't open my mouth to defend myself. I just looked past them, past the judge, past the wooden railing, keeping my gaze locked entirely on the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. The brass handles on those doors were tarnished. I counted my breaths. Inhale for 4 seconds. Exhale for 4 seconds. Exactly 4 seconds later, those heavy doors swung open with a resounding, echoing thud that made the bailiff jump. 2 uniformed sheriff's deputies and a tall assistant district attorney walked straight down the center aisle. Their heavy black boots hit the linoleum floor in perfect, rhythmic synchronization. They walked right past Lorcan's smug, handsome face. When the ADA bypassed the defense table and handed the judge the thick blue folder containing the criminal complaint, Lorcan's lawyer actually dropped his pen. It clattered against the wooden table, rolled off the edge, bounced on the floor, and hit the toe of my scuffed black shoe. He had absolutely no idea I had spent the last 21 days building a cage he would never walk out of. My name is Vada. I live in Knoxville, Tennessee. I am a florist. I spend my days up to my elbows in dark, damp potting dirt, harsh bleach, and the slick green residue of cut stems. My fingernails are permanently stained, and my hands are rough with calluses. It is a quiet life. It is a messy life. But it was mine. To understand how I ended up standing in a freezing municipal courtroom with a surgical drain taped to my abdomen, you have to understand a fundamental truth about who I am. I'm not a fighter by nature. I don't raise my voice, I don't slam doors. I am an observer. I sit in the corners of rooms and I watch how people move. I grew up in a house where chaos was the main course at every single meal. My mother was a hurricane of bad decisions and worse men. Our apartments always smelled like stale cigarette smoke, spilled beer, and cheap vanilla air freshener trying to cover it all up. We moved 7 times before I was in high school. The packing was never planned. It was always frantic, happening in the dead of night, throwing trash bags full of clothes into the trunks of cars that belonged to men whose last names I never knew. And every time we moved, things got lost. Important things. Birth certificates, medical records, rent receipts, utility bills. And every time something got lost, we paid the price. We got evicted because my mother couldn't prove she paid the landlord in cash, even when I saw her hand over the envelope. I got held back in the 3rd grade because she lost my immunization records, and the school wouldn't let me attend. The truth in my childhood was fluid. It was whatever the loudest person in the room said it was. My grandpa Silas took me in when I was 15. He lived in a small, drafty farmhouse on the edge of town. He was a quiet, hard-working carpenter who permanently smelled like fresh pine sawdust, strong black coffee, and peppermint candies. He sat me down at his scarred wooden kitchen table on my first night there. The kitchen was warm, heated by a cast-iron wood stove in the corner. I was terrified. My shoulders were practically touching my ears. I was waiting for the yelling to start. I was waiting for him to tell me what the new rules were, and how quickly I would be kicked out if I broke them. Instead, he walked over to the pantry, reached onto the highest shelf, and pulled down a heavy, dark, gray metal lockbox. He set it on the table between us. The metal was cold to the touch. "What's this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Yours," Grandpa Silas said, his voice like gravel grinding under a boot. "Open it." I fumbled with a small latch and opened the lid. Inside were neatly labeled manila folders. One had my name on it. Inside that folder was my original birth certificate, my social security card, and every report card I had ever received, perfectly preserved. "Vada," he said, leaning forward and looking me dead in the eye. "The world is going to try to convince you that you're crazy. People, especially bad people, thrive in the fog. The world is going to tell you that you didn't see what you saw, that you didn't say what you said, and that you didn't pay what you paid. There is only one defense against a liar." "What is it?" I asked, tracing the edge of my birth certificate. "Keep the paper. Keep the proof. If it isn't in writing, it didn't happen. You anchor yourself to the facts, and you never let anyone tell you that the sky is green when you have a photograph proving it's blue." And then he gave me a piece of advice that became the anchor of my entire life. Grandpa Silas always said, "A dog that bites once will eventually eat the whole hand." From that day forward, I started keeping receipts, literally and figuratively. It became my invisible superpower. I never delete an email. I back up my text messages to a secure cloud server every Sunday night. I never throw away a bank statement. I take screenshots of weird, passive-aggressive text messages and file them away. I write down dates and times in a small black notebook I keep in my purse. It wasn't paranoia. To me, it was survival. It was a compulsion born from a childhood where reality was always up for debate. I needed to know that my mind belonged to me. That one thing about me, that absolute, unwavering dedication to documentation, it's the reason this story has the ending it does. Keep that in mind. It matters. I built a good, solid life in Knoxville. After Grandpa Silas passed away, I used the small life insurance policy he left me to open my own floral shop near Market Square. It was a beautiful space, with exposed brick walls and massive front windows that let the morning light spill over the buckets of hydrangeas and ranunculus. I had a tiny one-bedroom apartment above a bakery. My mornings smelled like yeast and blooming jasmine. I had a dream of one day buying a small plot of land near the French Broad River to grow my own rare dahlias. I ate spicy pad thai on Friday nights. I watched terrible, mind-numbing reality television with my cousin Maura. Maura was 2 years younger than me, the daughter of my mother's sister. We had bonded over our shared family trauma. Or so I thought. Maura was everything I wasn't. She was loud, brash, and wore clothes that demanded attention. I was the quiet worker bee. She was the beautiful butterfly who flitted from job to job, crisis to crisis. I bailed her out of more than one financial mess, telling myself that family sticks together. And then I met Lorcan. He walked into my shop on a miserable, freezing, rainy Tuesday in late October. The bell above the door chimed, and a gust of wind blew in the smell of wet pavement and exhaust. I was behind the counter, my hair tied up in a messy bun, wearing a dirt-stained apron, trimming thorns off a batch of pale pink roses. He closed the door, shaking the rain from his umbrella. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that fit him perfectly across the shoulders. His shoes were polished. His hair was thick and perfectly styled despite the weather. When he looked at me, he had this smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. The air in the shop seemed to physically shift around him. "Please tell me you can save my life," he said, walking up to the counter. His voice was deep, smooth, resonant. I wiped my hands on my apron, suddenly painfully aware of the dirt under my fingernails. "Depends. Are you looking for a tourniquet or a bouquet?" He laughed. It was a warm, genuine sound. "A bouquet?" He laughed. "It's my mother's birthday. I completely forgot until 30 minutes ago. If I show up empty-handed, she'll write me out of the will. I need something that says, 'I've been planning this for weeks.'" "I can do that," I said, pulling a few stems of white lilies and blue delphinium from the cooler. "What's her favorite color?" He didn't just buy flowers. He stayed for an hour. He leaned against the counter, watching my hands move as I arranged the stems. He asked me about my business. He asked me how I learned to pair colors. He asked me what my favorite flower was. He listened with absolute, undivided attention. His dark eyes never left my face. "You're an artist, Vada," he said softly as I wrapped the bouquet in brown paper. "Most people just see weeds. You see architecture." For the first time in my entire life, I felt entirely, profoundly seen. My heart fluttered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Our early days were beautiful. I won't lie about that. You have to understand the intoxicating beauty of the beginning to understand the absolute devastation of the betrayal. We would walk around downtown Knoxville for hours in the biting cold. He would buy me hot coffees and pull me under his heavy coat to keep me warm. He smelled like expensive cedar cologne and crisp, clean laundry. He remembered my favorite foods. He remembered the names of my regular customers. He left small yellow sticky notes on my bathroom mirror while I was sleeping. "You are my everything," one of them said. "I'm the luckiest man alive," read another. I still have that sticky note. I keep it in a lockbox with the police reports. A little paper-thin reminder of the duality of monsters. But looking back, the warning signs were there. They were always there, flashing neon red in the background. I just chose to see them as quirky personality traits or signs of his intense devotion. I wanted to be loved so badly, I ignored the smoke until the house was burning down around me. The first sign was how he treated my time. He viewed my business not as a career, but as a cute little hobby that was constantly getting in the way of his schedule. It was a Friday evening, the day before a massive wedding I was designing. I was up to my knees in discarded leaves, frantically trying to finish 6 bridesmaids' bouquets. Lorcan showed up at the shop right at closing time, dressed for a fancy dinner. "Ready to go?" he asked, tapping his expensive watch. "Reservations are in 20 minutes. "Lorcan, I told you this morning I have to work late," I said, my hands trembling slightly as I wired a heavy succulent. "I need at least another hour to get these in the cooler and bleach the buckets, or the bacteria will kill the stems." He sighed heavily, a dramatic expulsion of air that made my stomach knot. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "Vada, I made these reservations a month ago. I'm trying to treat you like a queen, and you're prioritizing dead plants over our relationship." "They aren't dead plants, it's my livelihood," I pleaded, feeling the immediate surge of guilt he always managed to instill in me. "Please, just give me 30 minutes. You know what? Fine. I'll just sit here in the dark and watch you play in the dirt." he snapped. "But don't complain when the kitchen is closed by the time we get there." He sat on a stool in the corner, staring at me with cold, dead eyes, while I rushed through my work, making mistakes, my heart pounding with anxiety. I told myself he was just romantic. He just wanted to be with me. It wasn't nothing. The second sign was the phone. 6 months into dating, his phone suddenly became a highly classified, radioactive object. It lived face down on every surface. If it buzzed, he would snatch it up like it was made of hot coals. One night we were in bed. The room was dark, save for the blue glow of the street lamp outside. It was past 11 p.m. His phone vibrated on the nightstand, lighting up the room. He lunged across me, his elbow digging sharply into my ribs to grab it. "Ow!" I winced, rubbing my side. "Who is texting you this late?" He quickly typed a reply, his face illuminated by the harsh light of the screen, before shoving the phone under his pillow. "It's just work, Vada." "At 11 at night? On a Tuesday?" He let out a short, mocking laugh. "Yes, Vada. Not all of us arrange daisies for a living. Some of us have real stress. The global supply chain doesn't sleep." "I was just asking," I whispered, pulling the blanket up to my chin, feeling a cold prickle of unease wash over my skin. "Well, stop asking. You're acting paranoid. It's incredibly unattractive when you get clingy like this." The word hit me like a slap. Paranoid. I swallowed hard, the silence in the bedroom suddenly deafening. I told myself I was being insecure. I had baggage from my mother. It wasn't nothing. The third sign was Maura. I introduced Lorcan to my cousin Maura at a family barbecue in the middle of July. The air was thick with humidity, smelling of sweet charcoal smoke and cheap domestic beer. Maura arrived late, as always, wearing a sundress that left very little to the imagination. She was loud, immediately commanding the attention of everyone on the patio. I expected Lorcan, who was usually so refined and easily annoyed by boisterous people, to find her exhausting. Instead, I watched from the kitchen window as they spent the entire afternoon talking by the grill. They stood incredibly close together. Too close. I watched Lorcan lean in to whisper something in her ear, and Maura threw her head back in a loud, echoing laugh, placing her hand flat against his chest. My stomach plummeted. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck despite the 90-degree heat. I grabbed 2 fresh beers and walked outside, forcing a smile onto my face. As I walked up to them, they both went dead silent. The shift in the air was palpable. It felt like walking into a room where people had just been talking about you. "What are we talking about?" I asked, handing Lorcan a beer. My voice sounded thin and reedy. "Nothing," Maura said, flipping her long blonde hair over her shoulder and taking a sip of her drink. "Just telling him how lucky he is that someone like him ended up with someone like you." It was a compliment wrapped in barbed wire, which was Maura's absolute specialty. She was telling him he was out of my league. I looked at Lorcan, desperately expecting him to defend me, to pull me against his side and tell her I was the best thing that ever happened to him. He didn't. He just laughed, a low, conspiratorial chuckle, and took a sip of his beer. "She keeps me grounded," he said smoothly. I ignored the massive, twisting knot in my stomach. I pushed the voice of Grandpa Silas into the deepest, darkest corner of my mind. I married Lorcan a year later. We bought a beautiful 4-bedroom house in a nice subdivision with manicured lawns and matching mailboxes. I moved my floral business out of the small shop and into a much larger retail space downtown. We started trying for a baby. Everything looked absolutely perfect from the outside. But inside the walls of that house, the air was getting thinner and thinner. I felt like I was constantly suffocating, walking on eggshells so brittle they turned to dust under my feet. The escalation didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, measured drip of poison into my daily water supply. It started with public disrespect. We were at a fancy dinner party with his upper management colleagues from the logistics firm where he worked as a regional manager. I was wearing a dark green velvet dress I had bought specifically for the occasion. I had spent an hour doing my hair. I felt beautiful. Across the long dining table, over the clinking of crystal wine glasses and the smell of roasted lamb, one of his coworkers, a kind older woman named Barbara, smiled at me. Vada Lorcan tells me you own that gorgeous flower shop on Main Street. How is the expansion going? Before I could even open my mouth to answer, Lorcan laughed loudly, the sound cutting through the polite chatter of the table. Oh, it's just a hobby, really, Lorcan said, swirling his expensive red wine in his glass. Keeps her busy so she doesn't redecorate my house every week. She's not exactly a business mogul. I think she lost money last quarter buying too many decorative ribbons. The entire table went dead quiet. The silence was thick and agonizing. My face burned with a sudden, intense heat. I could feel the flush creeping up my neck. I looked at him, waiting for the punchline, waiting for him to say he was kidding, that I was actually incredibly successful. There wasn't a punchline. He just stared at me across the candlelight, his eyes cold, dead, and challenging. I confronted him in the car ride home. The leather seats of his SUV were cold. The hum of the tires on the asphalt was the only sound for 10 miles before I finally spoke. Why would you say that to Barbara? I asked, my voice shaking. You embarrass me. My shop pays half our mortgage, Lorcan. I just landed a massive corporate account. You're being crazy, he snapped, his voice instantly elevating to a yell that echoed in the confined space of the car. He gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles popped. I'm not crazy. You humiliated me in front of your boss. I was making a joke, Vada. Jesus Christ, why do you always twist things? You are so desperate to be the victim. Nobody else would put up with how sensitive you are. I was trying to make you sound relatable, but obviously you can't handle being in adult social situations. That was his favorite phrase. You're being crazy. You're twisting things. He said it with such absolute, unwavering conviction that I began to wonder if maybe he was right. Maybe I was too sensitive. Then came the new, terrifying phase of escalation. Active sabotage. It was the week before Valentine's Day, the most profitable, high-stress week of the year for a florist. I had over $12,000 worth of exotic orchids, premium red roses, and delicate tulips stored in my massive walk-in floral cooler at the shop. The temperature had to remain at exactly 38 degrees, or the flowers would bloom prematurely and die. Lorcan had stopped by the shop the night before to bring me dinner, a cold sandwich he practically threw on the counter before wandering into the back room to use the bathroom. When I arrived at the shop the next morning at 5 a.m., the air in the back room felt wrong. It was heavy, damp, and it smelled overwhelmingly sweet, the sickly, rotting scent of decaying vegetation. Panic seized my chest. I sprinted to the walk-in cooler and threw open the heavy metal door. A wave of warm, stagnant air hit my face. The digital thermostat on the wall was blank. The cooler was completely dead. Inside, thousands of dollars of inventory were ruined. The red roses had blown wide open, their petals browning at the edges. The delicate tulips were drooping over the edges of their buckets, completely limp. I dropped to my knees on the wet concrete floor, a sob ripping out of my throat. I crawled behind the massive compressor unit. The thick, heavy-duty power cord had been physically pulled out of the wall socket. It wasn't loose. It was lying 2 feet away from the outlet. I called Lorcan, my hand shaking so violently I dropped the phone twice. Lorcan, I sobbed when he answered. The cooler. Someone unplugged the cooler. Everything is ruined. I'm ruined. Calm down, Vada, you're screaming, he said, his voice flat, devoid of any alarm. What do you mean someone unplugged it? The cord. It's pulled out of the wall. Were you back there last night? Did you trip over it? Excuse me? His voice turned to ice. Did you trip? Are you blaming me for your incompetence? I brought you dinner because you were too disorganized to feed yourself. You were the one running around like a headless chicken. You probably unplugged it to plug in your phone charger and forgot, because your brain is a sieve. I didn't. The phone charger isn't even back here. Lorcan, the plug requires 2 hands to pull out. Listen to yourself, he sneered. You ruin your own business because you can't handle the pressure, and your first instinct is to blame your husband. This is exactly what I was talking about at the dinner party. You are mentally unstable, Vada. Fix your own mess. I have to go to work. He hung up. I sat on the floor among the rotting flowers, pulling my hair, genuinely wondering if I was losing my mind. Had I unplugged it? Was I going crazy? The fog was so thick I couldn't see my own hands in front of my face. After the sabotage came the physical control. He insisted we trade cars. He took my reliable, fuel-efficient Honda Civic and gave me his massive, temperamental diesel truck, claiming the truck was better for transporting large floral arrangements. But the truck constantly broke down. The battery would die. The transmission would slip. The cab always smelled faintly of old grease and sour cologne. Suddenly, I couldn't go anywhere without his help. If I wanted to visit Grandpa Silas's grave on Sunday, I had to ask Lorcan for a ride. If I wanted to go to the grocery store, I had to wait for him to get home. My world shrank down to the size of my shop and my house. And then, Mora's shadow grew longer, stretching across my shrinking world. I found a tube of lip gloss in the passenger door of my old Civic when I was searching for an updated insurance card in the glove box. I pulled it out of the side pocket. The plastic tube was sticky. It was a very specific, obnoxiously bright pink shade. Mora's signature color. It was literally a shade called Home Wrecker Pink. I wish I was joking. Literally, the universe absolutely loves heavy-handed symbolism. When I brought it inside and held it up to him, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, he didn't even blink. He didn't stutter. His heart rate didn't even seem to rise. "What is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. He glanced at it, then went back to watching the television. "It's lip gloss, Vada." "What, do you want a medal for identifying cosmetics?" "It's Mora's." "What is it doing in my car?" He sighed, pausing the TV and turning to look at me with an expression of profound pity. "Mora needed a ride to the mechanic last week. I told you about that. She left it in the car." "You did not tell me that," I said, my voice rising. "I asked you what you did on Thursday, and you said you went straight to the gym." "I did tell you we were standing right here in the kitchen." "Your memory is getting terrible, Vada." "Honestly, it's starting to worry me. You're forgetting conversations we have. You should really get that checked by a doctor. It's not normal for someone your age to be slipping like this." I stared at him. I hadn't forgotten. He never told me. But he said it with such absolute authority that for a terrifying, fleeting second, I questioned my own brain. The spatial violation happened next. My home, the one place that was supposed to be my sanctuary, stopped feeling like my home. I would come back from a grueling 12-hour shift at the shop, my back aching, my hands blistered, smelling like fertilizer and damp earth, only to find Mora sitting on my living room couch. She would be drinking my expensive wine, watching television with my husband, her bare feet tucked up onto the cushions. "Her pipes froze," Lorcan said one evening in late January, not taking his eyes off the basketball game on the screen. "Her apartment flooded. She's going to stay in the guest room for a few days until the landlord fixes it." "Why didn't you ask me?" I demanded, dropping my keys on the counter. "Because it's an emergency, Vada. God, do you have no empathy? She's your own cousin." She stayed for 3 weeks. During those 3 weeks, I felt like an invisible, unwanted ghost haunting my own house. They had inside jokes that they would laugh at across the dinner table while I ate in silence. They cooked dinner together while I was at work, leaving the sink piled high with dirty dishes for me to clean. I would do the laundry and find Mora's delicate, lacy underwear, mixed in with Lorcan's work shirts. One night I walked past the guest room and heard them whispering. When I opened the door, they sprang apart. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice shaking. I was helping her fix the latch on the window, Lorcan snapped, walking past me and bumping my shoulder hard. Stop snooping around, it's pathetic. If I could go back to that specific moment, I'd grab my younger self by the shoulders and tell her to run. I'd tell myself to pack a single bag, grab my lockbox, and disappear into the freezing night. But I stayed. I stayed because I loved the man he pretended to be. I stayed because I believed his gaslighting, convinced that I was truly a paranoid, forgetful, difficult wife. I stayed because we were trying for a baby, and I wanted a family so badly I was willing to swallow broken glass every day to get it. And then, the medical crisis hit, and the glass tore my insides apart. It was a Tuesday morning. The sky outside was a dull, bruised purple. I was standing in the kitchen pouring a mug of black coffee. The house was quiet. Lorcan was upstairs tying his shoes. Without warning, a pain ripped through my lower abdomen so violently, so completely, that my hand spasmed. I dropped the heavy ceramic mug. It shattered against the tile floor, sending scalding hot coffee splashing across my bare ankles. The pain wasn't just a cramp. It was blinding, white-hot, like a serrated hunting knife twisting deep in my pelvis. The room tilted violently. The edges of my vision went entirely black. I couldn't breathe. I collapsed to my knees, landing directly in the puddle of hot coffee and broken ceramic shards. I gasped for air, but my lungs refused to expand. I curled into a tight fetal position on the floor, clutching my stomach, letting out a raw, guttural moan. Lorcan walked into the kitchen, dressed in his crisp, tailored suit, smelling of cedar and fresh mint. He stopped. He looked at me writhing on the floor. He looked at the spilled coffee soaking into the grout. He looked at his polished leather shoes. "Really, Vada?" He sighed, sounding utterly exhausted by my mere existence. "I don't have time to clean this up today. I have a quarterly review meeting." "Lorcan," I choked out, a cold, clammy sweat breaking out across my entire body. Every word was agony. "Something is wrong. Something tore inside me. I need an ambulance." He rolled his eyes, a grand theatrical gesture of annoyance. "You're always dramatic around your period. You just want attention because I'm busy. Just take some ibuprofen and clean up this mess before it stains the tile." He didn't bend down. He didn't touch me. He stepped over my body, grabbed his keys from the counter, and walked out the front door. I heard the lock click behind him. I was alone. I dragged myself across the floor, my fingernails scraping against the tile, leaving a trail of bloody coffee behind me. I reached the living room, grabbed the phone off the end table, and dialed 911 myself. My vision was swimming. I remember whispering my address to the dispatcher before passing out. I woke up hours later in a stark white hospital room. The fluorescent lights buzzed aggressively overhead, sending daggers of pain behind my eyes. The sheets were stiff and smelled strongly of industrial bleach. A steady beeping sound echoed in my ears. I tried to move, but a thick, agonizing tightness pulled at my stomach. A doctor with kind, exhausted brown eyes stood at the foot of my bed, holding a metal clipboard. "Vada," she said softly, stepping forward and placing a warm hand on my ankle. "You're safe. You're in the hospital. You had a ruptured ectopic pregnancy." I stared at her, my brain struggling to process the words through the heavy fog of anesthesia. "Pregnancy?" "Yes," she said gently, her eyes full of profound pity. "You were about 7 weeks along. The embryo implanted in your right fallopian tube, and it ruptured this morning. We had to perform emergency surgery to stop the massive internal bleeding. I am so incredibly sorry, Vada, but you lost the baby. And due to the severity of the tissue damage, we had to remove your right fallopian tube completely. You lost nearly 2 liters of blood. You almost died on your kitchen floor." I felt her words hit me like physical blows from a heavy wooden bat. A baby. I had been pregnant. The family I had been praying for, crying for, begging the universe for. And now, it was gone. And part of my physical future, my ability to ever have a child, was gone with it. The grief wasn't just emotional. It was a crushing, physical weight on my chest, pressing the air out of my lungs. I squeezed my eyes shut, and a single hot tear rolled down my temple into my hair. 2 hours later, the door to my room swung open. Lorcan strolled in. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't frantic. He was holding a large paper coffee cup from a fancy artisan cafe downtown. He didn't look worried. He looked inconvenienced. He pulled up a plastic chair, dragging it across the linoleum, the screeching sound making me wince. He sat down and took a sip of his coffee. The smell of sweet vanilla syrup permeated the sterile room. "Well," he said, looking at the surgical drain protruding from my stomach with mild disgust. "The doctor in the hall said you lost it. Probably for the best, honestly." I slowly turned my head to look at him. My throat was raw from the breathing tube. "What?" "I mean, look at you," he said casually, picking a piece of lint off his suit jacket. "You can barely handle running a flower shop. You're constantly having panic attacks. You're forgetful. You're too mentally fragile for a child anyway. A baby would have pushed you completely over the edge into insanity." I stared at him. This was the man I married. The man who had promised to protect me. The man who was supposed to be my partner in this life. I was lying in a hospital bed, physically gutted, mourning the death of our child, hooked up to monitors and drains. And he was sipping a vanilla latte and telling me I was broken. "Where is Maura?" I whispered. My voice sounded like sandpaper rubbing against dry wood. "She's at the house," he said casually, taking another sip. "Someone has to feed the dog while I'm stuck here dealing with this." We didn't own a dog. He didn't visit me for the next 3 days. I lay in that hospital bed, staring at the textured acoustic ceiling tiles, counting the holes, feeling a profound, terrifying emptiness spreading through my veins. The nurses were incredibly kind. They brought me ice chips. They fluffed my pillows. One older nurse named Maria held my hand and stroked my hair while I sobbed uncontrollably into the dark hours of the night. But my husband was gone. When the doctors finally discharged me on Friday afternoon, Lorcan pulled the SUV up to the curb. He didn't get out to help me into the car. He didn't open the door. The nurse had to help me climb into the high passenger seat. He drove home in complete, suffocating silence. He had the radio turned up to a sports talk show. Every bump in the road sent a jolt of fire through my surgical incisions. When we pulled into the driveway, he turned off the car and walked inside, leaving me to fend for myself. I shuffled up the concrete driveway, hunched over like an old woman, clutching my stomach with both hands to protect the fresh, pulling stitches. When I finally pushed the front door open, the smell hit me first. The thick, cloying, unmistakable smell of Maura's heavy vanilla perfume. It was baked into the air. The living room was a disaster. Empty wine bottles cluttered the glass coffee table. 2 half-empty wine glasses sat on the end tables. A thick, fuzzy blanket was tangled in a messy heap on the rug in front of the fireplace. "I need my pain medication," I told Lorcan, leaning heavily against the hallway wall for support. My legs were shaking. The hospital had given me a paper prescription for heavy painkillers to manage the surgical recovery. I had handed the small paper slip to him in the car because I didn't have my purse. He stood in the kitchen staring at me. He reached into his suit pocket, pulled out the paper prescription, and looked at it. Then, maintaining dead eye contact with me, he ripped it in half. The sound of the paper tearing echoed in the quiet house. He stacked the 2 halves and ripped them again. He let the small white pieces flutter out of his hands, falling like snow onto the dark hardwood floor. "No," he said calmly. "What?" My brain couldn't process the visual information my eyes were sending it. "Lorcan, what are you doing?" "I'm not having a pillhead in my house," he said, his voice dripping with absolute puritanical disgust. "You have an addictive personality, Vada. You're weak-minded. If I let you feel that, you'll get addicted. You'll just use it as an excuse to lay in bed all day and not go to work. I'm not supporting a junkie. Take Tylenol." "Lorcan, they cut me open," I sobbed, the physical pain radiating through my pelvis, my back, my thighs. It felt like I was burning alive from the inside out. "I just had an organ removed. I am in agony. Please. Please don't do this. Stop being crazy, Vada," he said, turning his back to me and walking to the fridge. "I'm doing this for your own good. You'll thank me later." That night, I didn't sleep in my own bed. I slept in the guest room. Or rather, I lay awake in the guest room, sweating through the sheets, shaking violently, biting down on a rolled-up towel, so I wouldn't scream out loud from the raw, unmedicated pain tearing through my abdomen. Around 2 a.m., the house was pitch black. I heard footsteps in the hall. The floorboards creaked. I heard Lorcan's voice murmuring low and soft. And then, clear as a bell ringing in a quiet valley, I heard Maura's giggle. They were in the master bedroom. My bedroom. In my bed. I didn't confront them. I didn't march down the hall and burst through the door. The physical pain was far too immense to allow me to stand. But the emotional shock paralyzed me entirely. My brain short-circuited. I just lay there in the dark, staring at the blank wall, listening to the muffled sounds of their betrayal, while my entire reality fractured into a million jagged, irreparable pieces. The next morning was the cruelest moment of my entire life. As the gray dawn light filtered through the blinds, I managed to drag myself out of the guest bed. I was wearing oversized sweatpants and a thin gray t-shirt. My hair was matted to my head with sweat. The plastic surgical drain taped to my stomach was aching, half full of dark, bloody fluid. I shuffled into the kitchen, desperate for a glass of water to soothe my parched throat. Lorcan and Maura were sitting at the kitchen table. They were eating eggs, my eggs, on my plates, using my silverware. Maura was wearing Lorcan's oversized college t-shirt. Nothing else. Maura looked up from her plate, a cruel, victorious smirk playing on her glossed lips. "Oh, you're up. You look terrible, Vada. You should really put some makeup on. You look like a corpse." I didn't look at her. I looked at the man I had promised my life to. "Get out of my house," I whispered. My voice was hollow. I looked at Lorcan. "Tell her to get out right now." Lorcan stood up slowly. He wiped his mouth with a napkin. He didn't look angry. He didn't look caught. He looked entirely, terrifyingly calm. It was the face of a sociopath who had finally dropped the human mask. He walked over to me. Before I could back away, he reached out and grabbed me by my upper arm. His grip was like a steel vise. He squeezed, bruising the muscle instantly, and yanked me violently toward the front hallway. "Lorcan, stop!" I screamed, the sudden movement violently pulling the fresh stitches in my abdomen. "You're hurting me! Let go!" He ignored my screaming. He dragged me over the hardwood floor, my socked feet slipping, my body twisting in agony. He reached the front door and threw it open with his free hand. It was pouring rain outside, a freezing, bitter, sideways November Tennessee downpour. The wind was howling, rattling the windows. He shoved me hard, both hands against my shoulders. I flew backward. I fell out the door and onto the rough concrete porch, landing heavily on my bare knees and elbows. The impact sent a massive, blinding shockwave of absolute agony through my freshly operated abdomen. I gasped, all the air rushing out of my lungs, and curled into a tight ball on the wet concrete, shivering instantly. Lorcan stood in the warm doorway, looking down at me. He looked at me the way you look at a disgusting insect before you step on it. "You're a leaky faucet, Vada," he said, his voice completely devoid of any human warmth or hesitation. "You're broken, you're annoying, and you're ruining my morning. I'm throwing you out before you bleed on the floors. Don't come back." He slammed the heavy wooden door. I heard the deadbolt click into place. The chain slid across. I was outside, in the freezing, driving rain. I had no shoes, no coat, no phone, no keys. Within seconds, the icy water soaked through my thin t-shirt. I looked down and saw dark red blood beginning to bloom across the gray fabric near my surgical drain. The fall had torn my stitches. I dragged myself to the edge of the porch, seeking shelter under the small overhang. I sat back against the rough brick wall, shivering so violently my teeth clattered together. The rain whipped across my face. My body temperature was dropping rapidly. The pain in my stomach was a roaring fire, but my hands were going numb. I thought I was going to die right there on that porch. I really, truly did. I thought the cold and the pain would just slowly stop my heart. And as the darkness began to creep into the edges of my vision, I thought that maybe death would be a relief. It would finally stop hurting. But then, as I stared at the puddle of freezing rain forming near my bare feet, a quiet, internal click happened deep inside my brain. It wasn't an explosion of fiery rage. It wasn't a dramatic, screaming movie moment. It was a cold, hard, permanent shift in my fundamental chemistry. The frightened, gaslit, desperate victim inside me died on that freezing concrete. The woman who wanted to be loved at any cost took her last breath. And something else woke up in her place. Something colder. Something infinitely more patient. I turned my head and looked at the house next door. Mrs. Gable lived there. She was a 70-year-old retired middle school teacher. She had sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She always bought flats of orange marigolds from my shop in the spring. I didn't try to stand up. I knew my legs wouldn't hold me. I rolled onto my stomach. I crawled. I literally crawled on my hands and bare knees across the wet, muddy grass. The freezing mud squished between my fingers. The sharp blades of winter grass cut my knees. I dragged my bleeding abdomen across the lawn, hauling myself up the 3 wooden steps to her porch. I reached up with a muddy, trembling hand and banged on her heavy wooden door, leaving bloody smears on the white paint. When Mrs. Gable opened the door a minute later, she froze. When she saw me, soaked to the bone, covered in mud, shaking uncontrollably, and bleeding through my clothes, she didn't ask a single question. She didn't gasp. She didn't hesitate. "Good Lord, child," she breathed. She reached out, grabbed me by the armpits, and hauled me inside her warm, dry hallway. She immediately stripped off my soaking wet shirt, wrapped me in a massive, thick, heated blanket, sat me in a recliner, and dialed 911. I spent another 3 days in the hospital. The fall and the exposure had caused a massive, raging infection in my incisions. I was pumped full of broad-spectrum IV antibiotics and heavy painkillers. The fever dreams were intense. Lorcan didn't call the hospital. He didn't visit. He assumed I had crawled away to die quietly. What nobody in the world knew was that during those 3 days in the hospital bed, I didn't just sleep. I worked. The morning after I was admitted, I asked Mrs. Gable to visit. When she arrived, smelling of lavender soap, I asked her to go to my floral shop. I gave her the spare key hidden under the back planter. I asked her to bring me my heavy business laptop, its charger, and a fresh notebook. Mrs. Gable was my secret ally. She was a woman who had survived a brutal, highly contentious divorce in the 1980s, back when women had far less power, and she recognized the distinct stench of a monster when she saw one. She brought me the laptop hidden in a tote bag. Propped up on hospital pillows, an IV in my left hand, I opened the laptop. I logged into our joint bank accounts. That's when I found the bomb. While I was heavily medicated, lying unconscious in the hospital recovering from the ruptured ectopic pregnancy the week before, Lorcan had been busy. He had taken out a massive home equity loan against our house, and a secondary business loan leveraged against my floral shop's assets. The total amount transferred into a newly opened private offshore routing account solely in his name? Exactly $267,300. He had drained the equity of my life's work. But here was the catch. The bank required both spouses to sign for a home equity loan. They required the business owner's signature for the commercial loan. I hadn't signed anything. I had been unconscious, having an organ removed. I pulled up the digital, scanned copies of the loan documents from the bank portal. I zoomed in on the signature line at the bottom of the final page. It was a clumsy, pathetic, rushed forgery. But it wasn't Lorcan's handwriting. Lorcan wrote in sharp, aggressive, slanted block letters. The signature on the page had massive, bubbly loops on the V and the A. It was distinct. It was feminine. It was Maura's handwriting. She had sat in a room, claimed to be me, and forged my signature to steal $250,000 while I was bleeding out on an operating table. Grandpa Silas's gravelly voice echoed loudly in my sterile hospital room. Keep the paper. Keep the proof. Anchor yourself to the facts. I didn't call a divorce lawyer. Divorce lawyers argue over assets. Divorce lawyers sit in mediation rooms and try to find middle ground. Divorce lawyers ask you to compromise. I didn't want mediation. I didn't want half. I wanted total scorched earth annihilation. I looked at the notary stamp on the bottom of the forged document. I found the phone number for the notary's office. I downloaded a call recording app on my phone. I hit record. I called the notary. A man named Greg answered. "Hi, Greg," I said, my voice smooth, calm, and deadly. "My name is Vada Vance. I'm currently sitting in a hospital bed recovering from emergency surgery. I'm looking at a loan document bearing your official notary stamp, dated last Tuesday at 2 p.m. A document I never signed because I was under general anesthesia at the exact time this was stamped." Dead silence on the other end of the line. "Now, Greg," I continued, "I'm about to hang up this phone and call the FBI field office regarding federal wire fraud and notary malpractice. Unless, of course, you want to explain to me exactly who was sitting in your office." Greg panicked. The sound of his rapid, terrified breathing was music to my ears. He crumbled instantly. He admitted, his voice squeaking with fear, that Lorcan had brought his wife to the office. "I didn't check her ID," Greg babbled, desperate to save his own license. "I'm so sorry. Lorcan is a regular guy. He handles our firm's logistics account. I trusted him. He said you forgot your purse." "Describe the woman," I demanded. "She was tall," Greg stammered. "Blonde hair, really loud. She was chewing gum. And she had on this really bright, obnoxious pink lip gloss." "Thank you, Greg," I said. "I have this entire confession recorded." I hung up. I saved the audio file to my laptop hard drive, uploaded it to 3 different secure cloud servers, and emailed a copy to a private, encrypted email address I had just created. Then I called Mrs. Gable. I asked her to check her front porch Ring camera, the one mounted on her brick pillar that pointed directly at my front door. "Oh, honey," she whispered on the phone an hour later, her voice cracking with tears. "I have it. I went back to yesterday morning. I have the video. I have him dragging you. I have him throwing you onto the concrete in the rain. It's clear as day." "Don't cry, Mrs. Gable," I said, my voice dead calm. "Just send the file to my email." I spent the next 2 weeks hiding. I lived in the small, windowless back storage room of my floral shop, sleeping on a thin canvas cot, washing my hair in the deep utility sink where I bleached the flower buckets. Lorcan texted me exactly once during those 2 weeks. "I'm filing for an emergency eviction to get you off the house deed legally since you abandoned the property. Don't bother showing up to fight it, or I'll destroy your little flower business. Consider this a clean break." "You're welcome." He had absolutely no idea that while he was typing that text message, I was sitting in a leather chair downtown, handing the district attorney a heavy 400-page, meticulously tabbed binder. I didn't go to the regular police. The police would just knock on his door, ask a few questions, and Lorcan would gaslight them into thinking it was a domestic misunderstanding with a crazy wife. I bypassed the beat cops completely. I went straight to the white-collar financial crime division of the DA's office. I handed a senior investigator the binder. It contained the forged bank documents, the recorded audio confession from the terrified notary, the bank transfer receipts showing the exact routing numbers for the stolen $267,300, my heavily documented medical records proving I was incapacitated under anesthesia during the exact hour of the signing. And, on a small silver flash drive, the high-definition ring camera footage of Lorcan physically assaulting a bleeding post-op patient. The investigator, a hardened man with graying hair, opened the binder. He read the first 3 pages. He listened to the audio. He plugged the flash drive into his laptop and watched the video. He watched Lorcan shove me into the rain. The investigator closed his laptop. He looked at my pale face, looked down at the plastic surgical drains still taped to my stomach under my sweater, and leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Vance," he said quietly, "give me exactly 1 week." Which brings us right back to the freezing, lemon-scented courtroom. Lorcan had filed a frivolous civil motion to have me permanently, legally barred from the property, claiming I was a violent drug addict who had abandoned the marital home. He had actually brought Maura with him to court for moral support. She was sitting in the second row of the public gallery, wearing one of my expensive beige cashmere sweaters, loudly chewing a piece of peppermint gum. "She needs to vacate the property today," Lorcan told the judge, looking at me with pure, unadulterated contempt. "I can't have her sickness infecting my home anymore." The judge looked at the stack of fake, exaggerated paperwork Lorcan's expensive lawyer had submitted. Then the judge looked at me. I looked small. I looked pale. I looked defeated. "Mrs. Vance," the judge said, his voice echoing in the large room, "do you have a response to your husband's claims? Do you have legal representation?" I stood up slowly. The plastic drain pulled painfully at my raw skin. I placed my hands flat on the scarred wooden table. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, clear, and ringing with absolute certainty, "I don't need to respond to these claims. I believe the district attorney's office has a response for me." That was the exact moment the heavy oak doors swung open. The assistant district attorney walked down the center aisle, flanked by the 2 heavily armed, stone-faced sheriff's deputies. The ADA was a tall, imposing woman in a sharp navy suit, who clearly did not suffer fools. She bypassed the sputtering civil attorneys completely and approached the wooden bench. "Your Honor, my profound apologies for the interruption to this civil matter," the ADA said, her voice carrying absolute authority through the dead-silent courtroom. "But we have active no-bail felony warrants for the petitioner." Lorcan's lawyer dropped his gold pen. It hit my shoe. Lorcan blinked. He looked at his lawyer, then at the deputies. His handsome face twisted in confusion. "Warrants? For what? This is a civil eviction. I haven't done anything wrong." "Lorcan Vance," the larger of the 2 deputies said, stepping around the wooden divider and moving directly toward Lorcan's table. He said, "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and felony reckless endangerment." Watching Lorcan's face in that moment was the greatest visceral pleasure of my entire life. He went through a magnificent, rapid-fire, cinematic transformation. The smug, untouchable arrogance melted into deep confusion. The confusion morphed into sheer, unadulterated, primal terror. The blood drained out of his face so fast he looked like a wax corpse. His perfectly manicured hands started shaking violently against his thighs. "This is a mistake," Lorcan stammered, stepping backward, knocking his heavy leather chair over with a loud crash. "I'm a regional manager. I have a house. You can't arrest me. She's crazy. Ask her. She's a crazy, paranoid bitch. She made this up. We've seen the bank records regarding the stolen $267,300, Mr. Vance," the ADA said coldly, not breaking eye contact. "We have the notary's confession. And we've seen the high-definition video of you dragging a bleeding woman out into a freezing rainstorm. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. Right now." In the gallery, Maura suddenly stood up. Her face was chalk white. She dropped her purse. She tried to quietly inch her way toward the heavy oak exit doors, keeping her back to the wall. "Hold it right there," the second deputy barked, turning and pointing directly at Maura's chest. "Maura Gable, don't take another step. We have a warrant for your arrest as well. Conspiracy to commit wire fraud and felony forgery." Maura let out a high-pitched, warbling sound that I can only describe as a dying balloon. Her knees buckled. "No," Maura screamed. the sound echoing off the high ceilings. No, wait, it was his idea. Lorcan made me do it. He told me to sign the papers. He said we needed the cash for our new life together. He made me. She sold him out in less than 10 seconds. There is absolutely no honor among thieves. And there is certainly no loyalty among narcissists. No honor. They handcuffed Lorcan first. The deputy grabbed his arms, twisting them roughly behind his tailored suit jacket. The heavy metal cuffs clicked loudly, a harsh, ratcheting sound in the quiet room. Lorcan twisted his head to look at me over his shoulder. His dark eyes were wide, pleading, desperate. The charming, untouchable mask was completely, permanently gone. He was no longer the handsome man who had bought my flowers in the rain. He was just a pathetic, small, terrified man who had finally hit a solid brick wall he couldn't gaslight his way through. "Vada," he whispered, his voice cracking, tears welling in his eyes. "Vada, please, tell them. Tell them I'm sorry. Please, baby." I looked at him. I searched my chest for a feeling. I felt no anger. I felt no sadness. I felt absolutely, wonderfully nothing. True power isn't screaming. Power is in restraint. I offered him a small, polite, chilling smile. "Enjoy the cage," I said softly. I kept the receipts. 9 words. That was my entire goodbye. I turned around, picked up my thrift store purse, and walked out of the courtroom through the side door, leaving my husband and my cousin screaming profanities at each other in metal handcuffs. The cascade of their destruction was swift, brutal, and absolute. Within 2 weeks, Lorcan was fired from his high-paying logistics firm. They didn't even wait for a criminal conviction. The sheer public embarrassment of his arrest, combined with the federal fraud charges, was enough to terminate his contract immediately. The bank, realizing they had been defrauded, immediately froze all of his assets and seized the house to recoup the fraudulent loan money. Within a month, the crushing reality of federal charges set in. Wire fraud involving a federally insured bank carries heavy mandatory minimum prison sentences. Lorcan's fancy civil lawyer dropped him the moment the retainer ran out, leaving him with an overworked public defender who bluntly told him he was going to federal prison. Maura, utterly terrified of spending a decade in a windowless concrete cell, took a plea deal immediately. She testified against Lorcan in open court in exchange for 3 years of supervised probation, massive financial restitution, and a permanent felony record that guarantees she will never work in a corporate office, a bank, or a trusted position ever again. She currently works the overnight shift at a dingy gas station on the extreme outskirts of town. Our family completely disowned her. Her mother hasn't spoken to her in 2 years. Lorcan didn't take a plea. He took it to a jury trial, arrogant and defiant to the bitter end. He thought he could turn on the charm. He thought he could convince 12 strangers that I was a hysterical, crazy woman who had set him up. He couldn't charm Mrs. Gable's Ring camera footage. When the prosecutor dimmed the lights in the courtroom and played the video on the large screen, the video of Lorcan violently throwing his bleeding, freshly operated-on wife onto the freezing concrete, looking at her with pure hatred, and slamming the door, the courtroom went dead silent. 3 of the jurors actually cried. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding him guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 7 years in federal prison. He tried to write me a letter about 6 months into his sentence. It arrived at my new P.O. box in a cheap, stamped envelope. It was 10 pages of tightly scrawled handwriting. It was full of rambling apologies and endless justifications, blaming the stress of his job, blaming Maura's manipulation, blaming his childhood, blaming everything in the universe but himself. I didn't read past the first paragraph. I put the pages back in a manila envelope, took a thick black Sharpie, wrote "Return to Sender" across the front, and dropped it in the blue mailbox on the corner. I didn't need to hear his lying voice anymore. I had my own beautiful, quiet life to listen to. It took me a full year to fully recover. Physically, the scars healed into pale silver lines across my stomach. Financially, I had to work endlessly with the banks and credit bureaus to clear the fraudulent loans from my name. But the district attorney's ironclad conviction made that a smooth, undeniable process. I sold the florist shop in downtown Knoxville. I didn't want the memories attached to those brick walls. I didn't want to walk past the cooler he had unplugged. Instead, I used the clean, perfect credit I had fought like hell to protect. And I bought 3 acres of raw, beautiful land right on the edge of the French Broad River. I am sitting on the wraparound wooden porch of my new, small, white farmhouse as I tell you this story. It's a brisk, gorgeous morning in early April. The air smells like pine needles and damp earth. The sun is just starting to burn the thick, rolling mist off the surface of the river. In front of me, stretching out toward the water, are rows and rows of dark, freshly tilled soil. Next week, I will plant the first bulbs for my rare dahlia farm. My hands are covered in dark brown dirt. There's a slight, dull ache deep in my abdomen when the weather turns cold and it rains, a permanent physical reminder of the fire I walked through and the child I lost. But I am breathing. I am safe. I am completely, wonderfully alone, and my mind belongs entirely to me. Yesterday afternoon, I was cleaning out the dusty attic of the farmhouse, unpacking the last of my boxes. At the bottom of a cardboard box, I found my heavy gray metal lockbox. I opened it. Inside, beneath the police reports and the bank statements, I found an old faded yellow rent receipt from a terrible apartment I lived in when I was 10 years old. A tiny, fragile scrap of paper that had survived decades of chaos, moves, and monsters. I traced the faded ink with my dirt-stained thumb, and I smiled, thinking of Grandpa Silas sitting at his wood stove. A dog that bites once will eventually eat the whole hand. He was absolutely right. But what Grandpa Silas didn't know, and what Lorcan Vance found out the hard way, is that if you wait long enough, if you stay quiet, and if you keep your records perfectly straight, you can build a cage strong enough to hold the dog forever.